What's up guys, and welcome to my 2026 updated Yanqing guide. In this video I'm taking you over all the updated info in order to build and use Yanqing, including his kit overview, Lightcones, relic sets and ornaments, the stats you want to run, and also general team building ideas. Starting off with the overview on his kit, his basic attack deals ice damage based off his attack to a designated enemy. His skill deals ice damage based off his attack to a designated enemy and will activate Soul Steel Sync for 1 turn. His ultimate increases Yanqing's crit rate by 60%, and when Soul Steel Sync is active, Yanqing's crit damage will also increase by 50%. The buff will last for 1 turn, afterwards will deal ice damage based off his attack to 1 designated enemy. His talent, when Soul Steel Sync is active, Yanqing is less likely to be attacked by enemies, Yanqing's crit rate is increased by 20%, and his crit damage is increased by 30%. After Yanqing attacks an enemy, there's a 60% fixed chance to launch a follow-up attack, which will deal ice damage based off his attack to the enemy with a 65% base chance to freeze the enemy for 1 turn. The frozen enemy cannot take action and receives ice additional damage based off 50% of Yanqing's attack at the beginning of each turn, and if Yanqing takes damage, the Soul Steel Sync effect will disappear. This technique will give Yanqing at the start of the next battle 30% more damage for 2 turns to enemies who have 50% HP percentage or higher. His A2, after Yanqing attacks, deals additional ice damage based off his attack to enemies with ice weakness. His A4, when Soul Steel Sync is active, effect resist increases by 20%. And his A6, when a crit hit is triggered, increases speed by 10% for 2 turns. Finally, for his Eidolons, his E1, when Yanqing attacks a frozen enemy, he will deal ice additional damage equal to 60% of his attack. His E2, when Soul Steel Sync is active, energy regen rate increases by an extra 10%. His E4, when the current HP percentage is 80% or greater, this unit's ice res pen increases by 12%. And his E6, if the buffs from Soul Steel Sync or the ultimate are in effect when an enemy is defeated, the duration of the buffs will be extended by 1 turn. For Yanqing's best Lightcones, overall, the best one you can use is Zayle's signature Lightcone, which increases the wearer's crit rate by 18%, while the wearer is in battle for every 10 speed that exceeds 100. Damage up by basic attack and skill increases by 6%, and at the same time increases crit damage by ultimate by 12% and stacks up to 6 times. Crit rate is less desirable on Yanqing, since he does have a lot of crit rate access in his kit, but past the crit rate, it also does increase the damage for basic attack and skill, and also crit damage for ultimate. And to actually get this up, it's very easy. You need a total of 160 speed or higher in battle to get the full effect. Yanqing himself has a really high base speed of 109, always really ran with speed boots so you can do a -1 setup, and in his base kit also has a 10% speed increase. Combine that with speed rolls, you can actually get to 160 quite easily with them, and even if you're not getting to 160, maybe you're reaching 150 or maybe even like 140s and the higher, that's still fine, because when you are reaching 140 at least, that is 24% damage done for basic attack and skill, and 48% increase to crit damage for the ultimate. So Yanqing is very much able to utilize the second part of this Lightcone, increasing basic attack and skill damage and ultimate crit damage very effectively with how his speed does work. And the more you go up to 160, the further the performance of this Lightcone increases, but even at just 140, this Lightcone is very strong on him. Battle Pass Lightcone See You at the end is also very good on Yanqing, increasing his crit damage by 24%, and skill damage and follow-up attack damage though increases by the wearer by 24%. At S5, it's 40% crit damage with a 40% increase to skill damage and follow-up damage. Crit damage increase is very nice, so anytime you crit, you will do more damage. And as I did mention, the skill is what you are going to be mainly used, so that getting a 40% increase in damage though is really good. His follow-up attack, especially nowadays, like even back then, and just again, especially now, is never really that good. That was mainly there to get the actual effect to proc, freeze and such and so on. So honestly, nowadays, it's something that I'd rather just completely ignore, but this Lightcone is increasing that so you can actually get it to do a little bit of damage at least. But if this was ultimate damage instead, it would work a lot better on him, since that is going to be his main forms of damage. Skill is what you use throughout, and ultimate will be his biggest hit. But overall, even with the fact that this is mainly increasing skill damage and also providing you a big increase to crit damage, is why it's really good on him as well. Swordplay is also usable on him. For each time the wearer attacks the same target, damage though increases by 8% and stacks up to 5 times, and will be dispelled when changing targets. Yanqing is purely a single target DPS, and also by the way, it's 16% at S5. So because he is fully single target, you are mainly going to be targeting that one enemy. For smaller enemies, when you end up killing them, of course you're gonna have to restack it. It's also just really easy to restack it since he does hit a few times with the skill, and his ultimate also hits multiple times, so it is very easy to do. So once you start targeting an elite, it is really easy to stack up, and then for that elite, you'll have an 80% increase to damage dealt to that actual enemy, which is why it's also very much utilized on Yanqing. Those are really the best ones for damage. The other ones kind of come into a place where you can't fully utilize them, or they just focus on something mainly that's going to be something you don't want to completely focus on. But another usable option would be Dr. Ratio's Lightcone, increasing the wearer's crit damage by 20%. For every a debuff on the enemy target, the wearer's crit damage dealt to them additionally increases by 8%, stacking up to 3 times. Using ultimate to attack an enemy target will make the wearer receive the disputation effect, which will increase their damage dealt by 36% and enable the follow-up attacks to ignore 24% of the target's defense for 2 turns. 20% crit damage, so just overall sources of crit is going to do more. Further amplified with more debuffs on the enemy target, so if you're running someone on the team that can apply more debuffs, that's going to help since Yanqing can at least freeze, but you would need some form of other help, and usually supports have a form of a debuff, depending on the support at least, or if you just pair a debuffer alongside him, you can end up stacking up this really easily. So it's 20% crit damage to your actual build with an additional 24% crit damage dealt to enemy targets with 3 debuffs. At the same time, his ultimate does attack, so you get the disputation effect, which will then increase his damage by 36%, so his skill and such can do more damage, and then his follow-ups gain defense ignore, which is going to be nice. Again, it's mainly focusing on that, since of course this is tailored towards Dr. Ratio, whose follow-up attacks actually are the main focus, while Yanqing's are mainly just more of a utility side nowadays especially. But you can end up making them add to some pretty solid damage when you are using them with the defense ignore, especially if you're stacking other sources of defense shred / ignore, but that is why this Lightcone is also very much usable. For relic sets, the most consistent one is going to be 4-piece Scholar. 2-piece increases crit rate by 8%, 4-piece increases damage dealt by skill and ultimate by 20%. After using ultimate, additionally increases damage dealt by the next skill by 25%. 2-piece will help you build him to a better crit ratio, so that is very helpful. And then the 4-piece will increase his 2 sources of damage, skill being the main one you see, and ultimate being his biggest hit. And then after you do use his ultimate, the next skill you will do an additional 25% increased damage. So mainly, again, emphasizing on his main sources of damage, skill, and ultimate is why 4-piece Scholar is going to be the most consistent and best one to use. You can also use the Wind Soaring Valorous on him, which the 2-piece increases attack by 12%, 4-piece increases the wearer's crit rate by 6%. After the wearer uses a follow-up attack, increases damage dealt by ultimate by 36% for 1 turn. 2-piece will increase all his sources of damage since he does scale off attack. 4-piece helps with building him a bit with the crit rate. This set is mainly going to be one if you want to have his ultimate do the most damage as possible, since once you do proc his follow-up attack, your ultimate will have that 36% increased damage dealt for that turn. So as long as you get the follow-up attack, time it with your ultimate, and then you will get the biggest hit on your ultimate. So if you want to mainly emphasize on his ultimate damage and want it to do the most damage as possible as opposed to everything else, then you can use this set. Another set you can use if pairing him on a team with enough debuffs is the Pioneer set. 2-piece increases damage dealt to enemies with debuffs by 12%. 4-piece increases crit rate by 4%. The wearer deals 8%/12% increased crit damage to enemies with at least 2/3 debuffs. After the wearer inflicts a debuff on an enemy target, the aforementioned effects increase by 100% for 1 turn. So anytime enemies are debuffed, he will just do 12% increased damage to them. 4-piece also helps with building with 4% crit rate, and then you can do more crit damage based off the debuffs the enemies have, so you want to have 3 or more. So in this case, you would need someone else to help out with debuffs. Yanqing is able to inflict freeze, which is going to count as a debuff for the aforementioned effects increase, so you will need to proc that to actually get the effect. So if you are completely fine with that playstyle and making sure you get that freeze for the full effect, and you're running him on a team that has 3 or more debuffs on enemies at all times, then the Pioneer set is also going to be very strong. And then the last 4-piece would be 4-piece Hunter set. 2-piece increases ice damage by 10%. 4-piece after the wearer uses their ultimate, their crit damage is increased by 25% for 2 turns. Very simple. 2-piece will increase all his forms of damage since he is ice. 4-piece just use ultimate, you gain 25% crit damage for 2 turns. So anytime you use ultimate after that for those 2 turns, you will just do more damage every time you do crit. It's not as good as any of the other 3 sets that I did mention overall nowadays, but is still usable. Similar to other standard characters nowadays for DPS, I'm not going to recommend you do a 2-piece just because you want to get the full effects of a 4-piece to gain the actual maximum effect and to make him do damage that can at least be somewhat noticeable. For Planar Ornaments, overall his best in slot is still Glamoth, which will increase the wearer's attack by 12%, and when the wearer's speed is equal to 135/160, the wearer will deal 12%/18% more damage. Attack increase is just going to be good for all his forms of damage, as once again he is an attack scaler, and like I was talking about with the Zayla Lightcone, it's actually very easy to get higher speed on him. So even if you don't reach 160 speed, you have 12% increased damage, which is going to be good for all his forms of damage, and if you are able to reach 160 speed in battle or higher, then you get the full 18%, which further solidifies its spot as the best. So regardless, for 135 or 160 speed, if you're able to reach 160 speed, that's going to be ideal, and even if you're not, it's still overall the best one you can run. Besides that, you can also use Ruin Arena, which increases the wearer's crit rate by 8%. When the wearer's crit rate reaches 70% or higher, damage dealt by basic attack and skill increases by 20%. 8% crit rate good for building, 70% or higher crit rate shouldn't be a problem, and then you get a damage increase to basic attack and skill skill by 20%, mainly being the emphasis on the skill, since again, you will see that mostly throughout the battle. So for it, increasing the skill damage by a good amount is why it is very much good on him. If you want to mainly focus on his ultimate, then you can use Inertial Salto, which increases the wearer's crit rate by 8%. When the wearer's crit rate reaches 50% or higher, damage dealt by the wearer's ultimate and follow-up attack increases by 15%. Same thing as I mentioned with Rudolent, 8% crit rate, good for building, 50% or higher crit rate, less than Rudolent requirement, but again, nonetheless should not be a problem. And he does have the follow-up attack, so that also gets the increase, but it's mainly for the ultimate damage, since again, his follow-up attack damage is really not going to do that much regardless of your build. So if you again want his ultimate to do the best damage as possible and the biggest hit and fully emphasize on it, then you can use Inertial Salto. Personally, I do not recommend this. It is possible, but I much rather recommend mainly just running Glamoth or at least Rudolent Arena. For the main stats on the relics, for the body, you want to run crit damage. For the feet, you want to run speed. For the orb, you want ice damage. And for the link rope, you want attack percent. For the substats, first, your goal is going to be your speed breakpoint. Yanqing can hit 134 speed by just running speed boots, but be sure to get him up to 1 to 3 speed above it your actual action advanced support, since he always will be paired with someone like Sunday or Bronya. So he needs to just be a bit faster. You can also account for his 10% speed A3 that he does have. But of course, it's just better to have him always be that speed above. And if you want to fully cap out Zayle's Lightcone, of course, 160 speed is going to be the best. Past that is just your generic crit rate, crit damage, attack percent. For crit rate, again, you could factor in the ultimate buff plus his talent, which is a total of 80% crit rate on its own. Just remember, there are times where you potentially don't have his ultimate actually up. For the Soul Steel Sync buff at least, it will last for the turn after, but of course, sometimes you won't have it up unless you have an E6 Yanqing who's able to refresh it by killing. Realistically, you only need the 20% crit rate to get to the full 100% with everything active, but if you just want to be a bit more safe, you could roll more and more just to account for having enough for your downtime when your crit rate is not fully up. And in that case, you can build 40 to 60 just to be safe. You don't want to build so much crit rate on him to the point where it's just going to always be overcapped, obviously, and then also potentially just wasting other stats. You mainly just want to focus on crit damage and attack percent. Those are where his main damage stats are going to be, but just getting enough crit rate to help you at those times where the crit rate buff isn't active is going to be nice. Getting attack to around 2500 or higher would be good, and then for crit damage, 200% or higher. Team building for Yanqing is very simple, as he has a relatively structured layout nowadays especially. So of course the second support is going to be his -1 setup, because hyperspeed support with Yanqing nowadays is just not recommended. It's better to do -1 for the best output, and Sunday is going to be the best install for that. So Sunday is usually going to be the one. If you don't have Sunday, you could also use Bronya. She is a bit worse, but Sunday is going to be ideal, so it would just be these two. And another character that's always going to be with Yanqing is a shielder. No matter what your team is, you're going to want a shielder, because if Yanqing gets hit, his debuffs go down, his buffs go down, and effectively can't do anything. Yanqing is going to be his best in slot sustain, especially because of the synergy that Sunday provides, since Yanqing is able to activate Sunday's extra parts with the extra damage dealt and such, for making Yanqing technically have a summon because of how Yanqing does work. So Sunday and Yanqing are going to be the cornerstone of Yanqing's teams and be on his best in slot teams. Of course, if your Yanqing is in use, you can instead use Aventurine. Aventurine is completely fine as well, and if you really need to, you can also use Jeopard. So if your Yanqing is taken, and then for Aventurine, if he's taken as well, or you just don't have him, in that case, you could use Jeopard. It's going to be harder with him, but it does work for a shielder, but mainly these two would be the cornerstone for best results. And of course, last slot would go to either another support or a debuffer. You could use an AoE buffer such as Robin. Robin works great with Yanqing and especially older characters. Tribi also is really good with universal buff slash debuff, especially if you have her E1. And if you're running him on Pioneer or something, running someone like Cypher is also going to help out a lot. But in general, you can use other debuffers such as Silver Wolf as well. Silver Wolf also does work fine there. Raw and May also does pair really nice with Yanqing with the buff she does provide, so she can also go on there as well. But in my case, I'm just going to go ahead and put Tribi so the team could look something like this. And that is the full 2026 updated Yanqing guide. I do hope you found this video helpful. If you did, dropping a like would be greatly appreciated. If you're new to the channel or haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon for future videos like this, along with all other types of Star Wars content. Check the description to check out my Ornaments channel, and I'll see you later. Peace out.